They called him a fool, a broken soldier chasing a cursed horse no man could touch. But on a freezing winter night in Nebraska, when laughter rang louder than mercy, Jacob picked up his father's banjo and changed everything. This is the story of a man and a wild stallion who taught each other how to breathe again and left an entire town in tears. The wind cut sharp across the frozen streets of the small Nebraska town, carrying with it the smell of hay, smoke, and iron. It was the kind of December morning where even laughter felt brittle, breaking in the air like shards of ice. In the middle of the fairground, a crowd had gathered, boots stamping on the snow-packed dirt to keep warm, eyes fixed on the black beast that refused to bow. Thunder. The stallion lived up to his name. His coat shimmered like wet coal beneath the pale sun, every muscle coiled with defiance. 3 men strained at the ropes that pinned him to a post, their boots dragging furrows through the snow. Thunder reared, forelegs striking the sky, and with a violent thrust, he sent 2 of them sprawling. Gasps shot through the crowd, followed by a burst of laughter. "Wild as the devil himself," someone shouted, and the jeers rolled through the onlookers like a cruel tide. "Send him to slaughter already. No man's fool enough to try him." Old Bert, owner of the largest horse farm in the county, spat into the snow. "That creature's cursed," he barked. "I'll put him down before he kills a man." The words seemed final, carried on the cold air as if written in stone. But at the edge of the crowd stood a figure who did not laugh, did not jeer. Jacob Harris, tall and wiry beneath a weathered brown coat, his face still young but carved with lines no youth should carry. He had been back from the war only a few months, and though his body had returned, a part of him still wandered those broken fields far away. He shifted the weight of the old banjo case slung across his back, its leather strap worn smooth by his father's hands long before him. The instrument was all he had left of a man who taught him patience by the fire, a man who said music could heal more than words. Jacob hadn't believed that, not until the war silenced every voice he loved. Thunder's eyes caught his, wild, furious, daring anyone to come closer. But behind that rage, Jacob thought he saw something else. A flicker, a shadow of the same thing he carried inside. A spirit cornered, too proud to show its wounds. "I'll take him," Jacob said, his voice calm but firm enough to cut through the mocking noise. The crowd froze. Then came the laughter, louder than before. "You'll take him?" Bert's lip curled. "You? Boy, that horse will break you before you set foot in the stirrup. Best leave beasts like him to men who know what they're doing." But Jacob didn't flinch. He stepped forward, boots crunching in the snow, and reached for the rope. Thunder snapped his head, teeth flashing, muscles surging against the tether. The men who held him staggered back, swearing, but Jacob simply waited, silent, steady, like a man staring down the barrel of something he'd seen before. "Get your papers signed then," Bert barked, shaking his head. "When he kills you, don't say I didn't warn you." The crowd parted as Jacob led Thunder away, each step a battle of will. The stallion's hooves struck sparks against the frozen ground, his breath rising in white clouds, but Jacob kept walking, hand firm on the rope, eyes fixed on the open road beyond the fairground. Behind him, voices chased him like ghosts. "Fool! Dreamer! He'll never tame that devil!" Jacob didn't answer. He didn't need to. The war had taught him that silence could be stronger than shouting, that the truest battles weren't fought with fists or bullets, but with patience. As he guided Thunder toward the edge of town, the jeers faded behind him, swallowed by the wind. The stallion lunged again, nearly ripping the rope from Jacob's grasp. The jolt sent pain shooting up his arm, but still he held firm. He could feel the animal's fury thundering through the line between them, yet he also sensed something else beneath it. Fear. Fear disguised as rage, the same way his own grief hid behind silence. Snowflakes drifted from the gray sky, landing on the stallion's dark coat, melting against the heat of his trembling muscles. Jacob's breath came in steady clouds. One step, then another, and another. The road stretched long and lonely ahead, leading toward the barren cornfields and the small farmhouse that waited for him on the horizon. His father's house. His house now. As the fairground disappeared behind them, Jacob spoke softly for the first time, not to the crowd, not to himself, but to the restless animal at his side. "You're not the only one they laugh at." The words carried no judgment, only truth. And though Thunder jerked his head and hissed through flared nostrils, Jacob thought, just for an instant, that the stallion's ears twitched toward his voice. "You're not the only one they laugh at." The words lingered in the frozen air long after Jacob whispered them. Thunder yanked against the rope again, but Jacob tightened his grip, guiding the restless stallion down the rutted road toward the farmstead that had been in his family for generations. The snow fell heavier now, muffling the distant sounds of town. By the time the last rooftop disappeared into the gray mist, it was just the two of them, the soldier who had returned, and the beast nobody wanted. The farmhouse stood like a tired sentinel at the edge of the cornfields, its clapboard walls scarred by years of storms. The shutters rattled as the wind drove through the empty stalks, and the porch sagged slightly, as if mourning the man who once fixed every board with his calloused hands. Jacob paused at the gate, feeling a pang in his chest. This place had always belonged to his father. Now it was his, though it didn't feel like home. Not yet. He tied Thunder to the rail of the weathered barn. The horse reared, striking the post, but Jacob spoke quietly, his voice low enough to be almost swallowed by the storm. "You'll be safe here. That's more than they ever gave you." Thunder's dark eyes burned with suspicion, but he stilled enough for Jacob to step back. Inside the farmhouse, silence pressed in. The walls carried no laughter anymore, only the faint smell of cedar and smoke that lingered from years past. Jacob removed his coat and set it on the back of a chair, then carefully unstrapped the banjo case from his shoulder. He laid the instrument on the table as if it were something alive, fragile as glass. His hand hovered over it before pulling away. He wasn't ready to hear the sound yet. Not tonight. The firewood was stacked neatly beside the stove, cut weeks earlier when he still hoped that routine would feel like purpose. He lit the kindling, the flames growing until warmth began to seep into the room. The banjo glinted faintly in the light, and Jacob sat across from it, staring as though waiting for it to speak first. But the silence spoke instead. It spoke of gunfire that never left his ears, of sand and smoke in faraway deserts, of a friend whose laughter had once filled those nights but was silenced forever in a burst of chaos. Jacob closed his eyes, pressing his palms to his face. Coming home had not ended the war. It had only made it quieter. Outside, thunder stomped against the frozen ground, the sound echoing through the barn boards. Jacob stood and went to the window. The stallion's black figure shifted restlessly in the storm, steam rising from his body. The horse was a reminder of everything Jacob wanted to escape. Untamed fury, raw power, the kind of violence that could not be reasoned with. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't let the animal be destroyed. The next morning, pale sunlight broke through the gray clouds. Jacob pulled on his boots and stepped into the brittle air. Thunder's breath steamed, his eyes sharp, watching Jacob's every move. Jacob filled a trough with water, his hands stinging from the cold. The horse did not move closer, but neither did he rear. It was a standoff, two creatures bearing scars they refused to reveal. Jacob leaned on the barn door, his breath clouding. "I don't know how to fix you," he admitted softly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to thunder or himself. "But maybe fixing isn't the point." The horse tossed his head, snorting, the sound like a challenge. Jacob almost smiled. There was something familiar in the defiance. In town, they called thunder a monster. But Jacob knew better. Monsters didn't fight because they wanted to. They fought because no one ever gave them another choice. Inside the barn, Jacob spread fresh straw, the scent filling the air with a sweetness that clashed against the horse's sweat and agitation. He hummed, a tune so soft it was nearly lost in the wind sneaking through the cracks. Thunder's ears flicked. For just a second, Jacob thought he saw the stallion's rigid body soften, but then the animal pawed the ground, as though remembering it was supposed to resist. That night, Jacob sat at the small wooden table, banjo resting on his knee. He didn't strum, not yet. He simply held it, fingers pressing against the cool strings. His father's voice rose in memory. "Music isn't about taming, son. It's about listening. If you listen long enough, something will answer." He let out a shaky breath and brushed a single string. The note rang fragile but clear, vibrating in the silence. Outside, thunder whinnied sharply, as if the sound had pierced the cold night air. Jacob froze. Then, with a trembling hand, he played another. The horse stomped once, twice, but didn't rear. Jacob's heart quickened. Slowly, he played a third note, and then another, building a melody that faltered but kept going. His fingers remembered what his spirit had nearly forgotten: that music was a way back to life. When the last note faded, Jacob sat in silence, chest rising and falling. He didn't know if thunder understood, but he knew the stallion had heard. For tonight, that was enough. And somewhere in that silence, between the soldier and the untamable horse, was the faintest promise that both might survive this winter together. The last note of the banjo trembled in the farmhouse until the wind swallowed it whole. Jacob sat there, fingers hovering over the strings, wondering if he had imagined the way thunder stilled outside. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and let out a long breath. For the first time in weeks, he hadn't thought about the desert, the gunfire, or the friend who never came home. Music had carried him somewhere quieter, somewhere almost safe. A knock startled him. It was soft, uncertain, and carried through the cold air like a polite question. Jacob set the banjo aside and crossed to the door. When he opened it, a gust of icy wind swept in, bringing with it the faint scent of cinnamon. Grace stood there, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, a wool scarf wrapped snug around her neck. In her hands she held a basket covered with a cloth, steam slipping through the fabric. She smiled, though her eyes searched his face carefully, as if checking whether she was welcome. "I thought you could use something warm," she said, holding out the basket. Jacob hesitated, then accepted it with both hands. The heat seeped through the cloth, thawing his frozen fingers. He lifted the corner and found golden squares of cornbread inside, still glistening with melted butter. For a moment, the smell transported him to years long gone. His mother humming in the kitchen, his father returning from the fields. "I don't usually—" Jacob's voice caught. He cleared his throat. "Thank you." Grace stepped inside when he moved aside, brushing snow from her coat. Her eyes roamed the small kitchen, lingering on the banjo resting on the table. "I heard you playing," she said softly. "It's been a long time since music came from this house." Jacob's jaw tightened. He wanted to tell her it wasn't real music, just broken notes to fill the silence. But instead he busied himself by placing the basket on the table. "It helps me think," he muttered. She watched him for a long moment. "People say you're wasting your time with that horse," she continued carefully. "That no one can change him." Jacob looked out the window, where Thunder's dark shape shifted against the barn. "They're probably right. But maybe they're wrong." Grace's voice was gentle, but steady. "Sometimes the strongest things just need someone willing to listen." The words echoed something his father once said, and Jacob felt the weight of them settle in his chest. He didn't answer, but he didn't push her away either. Grace unwrapped one of the cornbread squares and broke it in half. She placed a piece in Jacob's hand before taking a bite herself. The warmth and sweetness filled his mouth, unexpected after weeks of bland rations and solitude. It was more than food. It was a reminder of community, of life beyond survival. They ate quietly, the crackle of the fire filling the silence between them. When she finished, Grace wiped her hands on her scarf and stood. "I should go before the storm gets worse." Jacob walked her to the door. Before she stepped out, she looked back at him, her expression soft but resolute. "Don't let them convince you you're alone in this. Not with the horse. Not with anything." The door closed behind her, leaving Jacob with the fading warmth of her presence and the lingering taste of cornbread. He stood there for a moment, hand on the wood, before turning back inside. Outside, Thunder pawed the ground, restless. Jacob pulled on his coat and stepped into the night. The horse snorted as he approached, muscles rippling beneath the black coat. Jacob held out the other half of the cornbread, palm open. Thunder's ears flicked, his nostrils flared, steam curling in the cold. Slowly, cautiously, the stallion stretched his neck toward Jacob's hand. The bread disappeared in one swift bite, and Thunder jerked back, stamping once as if to declare he hadn't surrendered. But Jacob smiled anyway. "It's a start," he whispered. For the first time since returning from war, Jacob felt something unfamiliar, a fragile thread of connection. It wasn't trust yet, but it was more than hostility. It was the first step in what might one day be called healing. And just like cornbread on a winter night, it was enough to remind him that even in the harshest seasons, warmth could be found. "It's a start." The words slipped into the darkness as Jacob drew his coat tighter around his shoulders. Thunder shook his mane, scattering snowflakes like sparks from a fire, then turned away as if unimpressed by the meager offering of cornbread. But Jacob didn't mind. For a creature that had known only chains and jeers, a single step forward was no small thing. That night the storm passed, leaving the sky polished and clear. The moon rose high above the corn stubble fields, silver light painting the land in shades of steel and frost. Jacob walked outside with the banjo slung across his back, boots crunching in the hardened snow. The cold bit at his cheeks, but something inside urged him forward, to the barn, to the restless soul waiting there. Thunder was pacing when Jacob entered, hooves striking rhythm against the wooden floor. The horse tossed his head, eyes flashing. Jacob leaned against the rail, calm, letting the silence stretch. He remembered Grace's words from earlier. Sometimes the strongest things just need someone willing to listen. He set the banjo on his knee, not strumming right away. Instead, he simply breathed, letting the night air steady him. Then, softly, he plucked a string. The note quivered, thin but clear. Thunder's ears flicked, catching the sound like a faint echo from another world. Jacob let the melody grow, unhurried, weaving gentle chords into the cold air. The barn seemed to shift with the sound, shadows deepening, dust drifting lazily in the moonlight. Thunder stopped pacing, his muscles still tense, but no longer restless. He stood near the far wall, ears turning toward every note. "You hear it, don't you?" Jacob whispered between chords. "It doesn't ask anything from you. It just is." He kept playing, each note like a thread thrown across the space between them. Slowly, Thunder stepped closer, the heavy thud of his hooves softened by the straw. Jacob's fingers trembled, but he didn't stop. The horse snorted, lowered his head slightly, then lifted it again as if debating whether to yield. The wind pushed through the barn cracks, carrying the scent of snow and pine. Jacob closed his eyes and played on, letting memory guide him. He remembered the lullabies his mother used to sing, his father's patient strumming on summer nights, the way music once filled this farm with life. For a few fragile minutes, the war receded, and he was simply a son, a farmer, a man with a banjo in his hands. When he opened his eyes, Thunder was standing only a few feet away. The stallion's breath rose in white clouds, his dark eyes glinting in the moonlight. Jacob slowed the tune, letting the notes fade into silence. Thunder stamped once, a sound like punctuation, then stood still, watching him. Jacob set the banjo down and stepped closer to the stallion, careful not to rush. The horse flinched, muscles rippling, but didn't bolt. "Easy," Jacob murmured, his hand outstretched. His palm hovered in the air, waiting. Seconds stretched into eternity, and just when Jacob thought Thunder might turn away, the stallion lowered his head an inch. Not enough to touch, but enough to acknowledge. It was not surrender, not trust, but it was something, an unspoken agreement beneath the first moonlight of winter. Jacob exhaled, his breath mingling with the horses in the cold. "We'll get there," he said quietly. "One night at a time." The moon arched higher, bathing them both in silver. Jacob felt the weight of loneliness shift ever so slightly. He wasn't healed. Neither was Thunder. But in that barn, under the pale watch of the sky, they shared a silence that no laughter or jeer could ever break. When Jacob finally returned to the farmhouse, the fire had burned low, shadows stretching long across the walls. He sat at the table, banjo resting against the chair, and closed his eyes. The image of Thunder standing still, listening under the moonlight, stayed with him. For the first time since the war, he allowed himself to believe that maybe healing was possible, not through force, but through patience, through quiet nights and fragile beginnings. And when sleep came, it carried with it not the screams of battle, but the soft sound of hooves settling into straw, and the faint echo of music under the winter moon. The dream carried him gently. No gunfire, no desert, only the muted thud of hooves in snow and a melody that never fully faded. Jacob stirred awake before dawn, the fire in the stove long dead, the farmhouse cold enough to see his breath. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and listened. The world outside was muffled, wrapped in the silence of heavy snowfall. He pulled on his coat, the banjo slung across his shoulder more out of instinct than choice, and stepped into the storm. Snowflakes clung to his lashes, the kind that fell thick and steady, promising to bury everything if given enough time. The barn loomed like a shadow, its roof wearing a white crown. Thunder was there, pacing again, but slower this time, as if the weight of the storm pressed him down. Jacob pushed open the door, the hinges groaning. The stallion turned, ears pinned, breath surging in great clouds. Their eyes met, two creatures awake before the world, bound by the same restless energy. Jacob set the banjo on his knee, fingers stiff from cold, and began to play. The strings hummed faintly, the sound fragile against the howl of wind. He played anyway, letting the music braid itself with the storm. Thunder snorted, stamped once, then stood still. Slowly, the great head lowered, nostrils flaring. Jacob closed his eyes. The notes carried him back to summer nights before the war, when his father's hands guided his own across the strings. "It's not about making music perfect," his father had said. "It's about giving it a heartbeat." Now, in the freezing barn, Jacob played not for perfection, but for life, for the horses, for something greater than survival. When he opened his eyes, thunder had stepped closer. The stallion's breath rolled in, white plumes mingling with Jacob's in the frigid air. Their distance shrank to nothing but the width of fear itself. Jacob stopped playing and let the silence speak. The only sound was the steady rhythm of two sets of lungs, breathing together. "Easy," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling not with fear, but with awe. He lifted his hand, palm open. Thunder's muzzle hovered, warm and damp, inches away. Snow blew in through the cracks of the barn, landing softly on Jacob's sleeve. The stallion lingered there, close enough for Jacob to feel the heat radiating off his body, though not yet ready to touch. It was more than Jacob had dared hope for. He lowered his hand slowly, not forcing what wasn't yet given. Trust couldn't be pulled like rope. It had to be offered like breath. Hours later, when the storm had quieted and the pale light of morning seeped through the slats, Jacob emerged from the barn with his banjo case under his arm. The world outside was remade. Fields buried under white, fences softened by snow. He turned back once, seeing Thunder's silhouette framed in the doorway, watching him. For the rest of the day, Jacob shoveled paths through the drifts, his muscles burning with the kind of effort that grounded him. Between trips, he glanced at the barn, where the black stallion shifted, restless but no longer raging. There was something different now, a rhythm forming, like a fragile investment slowly gaining interest. Not money, but trust, patience, a kind of insurance against the loneliness both had known too long. That evening, Jacob carried a lantern to the barn. The snow had stopped, leaving the night crisp and star-pinned. Thunder stood waiting, dark against the golden light. Jacob set the lantern down and began to hum before he even opened the banjo case. The tune was simple, low, steady, like the heartbeat his father once spoke of. Thunder's ears flicked, then stilled. Jacob strummed softly, each note carrying warmth into the frozen air. This time, the stallion did not pace, did not stamp. He stood still, head slightly lowered, breath rising in slow, heavy clouds. Jacob's chest ached with something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He stopped playing after a while, letting silence close in again. But the silence no longer felt empty. It was full of breath, of presence, of something unspoken between them. Jacob leaned against the stall, lantern light soft on his face, and whispered, "We'll make it through this winter, you and me." Thunder shifted, released a deep, rumbling exhale, and for the first time, it didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like agreement. "We'll make it through this winter, you and me." The words still hung in the barn when Jacob doused the lantern and stepped out into the brittle night. The stars glittered sharp as glass, and his boots sank into snow that had turned crisp under the frost. He felt lighter, though he couldn't have said why. The promise had slipped from his mouth before he'd thought about it, yet now it anchored him in a way no battlefield oath ever had. The following days settled into rhythm. Morning chores, long hours clearing snowdrifts from the path to town, evenings with the banjo in the barn. Thunder no longer raged as he had before. He still tested the rope, still stamped and tossed his head, but the violence was tempered, his fire no longer blind fury. Jacob took comfort in the progress, however slight. But the town had not forgotten. On the third Sunday after the storm, Jacob hitched his wagon and drove into town for supplies. The streets were alive with the usual winter bustle, children throwing snowballs, women wrapped in scarves carrying baskets, men gathered outside the feed store talking of weather and politics. The moment Jacob stepped down from the wagon, a ripple went through the crowd. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. "There's the dreamer," someone muttered. Jacob ignored it, pulling his coat tighter. Inside the general store, the warmth and scent of spices offered momentary relief. He collected flour, kerosene, and salt, nodding politely at Mrs. Carter behind the counter. But when he turned, he nearly collided with Bert. "Well, well," Bert drawled, his voice carrying. "If it isn't our soldier boy, how's that demon of yours treating you? Killed you yet?" Laughter erupted from the men standing nearby. It was sharp, cutting, the kind that slid under the skin and stayed there. Jacob's jaw clenched. He set the sack of flour on the counter with more force than necessary, then straightened, meeting Bert's gaze. "He's alive," Jacob said evenly. "That's more than anyone expected." Bert smirked, chewing his tobacco slowly. "Alive, sure, but not tamed. A beast like that can't be fixed. You're wasting your time. You should have let me put him down, saved yourself the trouble." The laughter rose again, echoing off the walls. It reminded Jacob of another kind of laughter, years ago, soldiers jeering in the barracks to hide fear, or the hollow cheer after a firefight when someone cracked a joke about survival. It was the sound of men masking weakness with noise. And it burned. Jacob gathered his supplies without another word and walked out. Behind him, the laughter chased him down the street, a bitter wind carrying it all the way to the wagon. He loaded the sacks in silence, his face hard, but inside something cracked. On the drive home, the corn stubble fields rolled by, blanketed in snow. Thunder's dark shape awaited him at the barn, visible even from a distance, a sentinel against the white. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop and unloaded in silence. That night, he didn't play. He sat in the barn with the banjo across his lap, fingers idle, while Thunder shifted restlessly. The laughter still rang in his ears, cruel and unrelenting. Jacob stared at the horse, and for a moment he almost envied him. The stallion had never had to explain. Himself never had to endure mockery. He simply was what he was. "You don't know what it's like," Jacob whispered bitterly. Thunder snorted, ears flicking at the sound. Jacob leaned forward, his voice low, raw. "They laugh at me the same way they laughed at you. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am just a fool." The banjo slipped from his hands, strings jangling as it hit the straw. Jacob buried his face in his palms, shoulders shaking with the weight he had carried too long. The war had taken his friend, and now the town mocked what little hope he had left. But then a sound rose above the silence. Not laughter. A deep, rolling breath. Thunder stepped closer, hooves crunching softly. He lowered his great head near Jacob's shoulder and exhaled, warm air pushing against the cold between them. Jacob lifted his face, stunned. For the first time, the stallion had approached him willingly, not drawn by food or music, but by something else entirely. Shared defiance against the echo of laughter that haunted them both. Jacob reached out, slowly, hand trembling. He didn't touch the horse, not yet, but he didn't need to. The closeness itself was enough. The laughter from town still lingered in his memory, sharp and cruel. But here, in the hush of the barn, another sound had risen to meet it, the steady rhythm of breath, shared in the dark, louder than mockery, stronger than scorn. And Jacob knew, with a clarity that surprised him, that the townsfolk could laugh all they wanted. He would not stop. Not now. Thunder's breath lingered warm against Jacob's shoulder, a fragile bridge between defiance and surrender. Jacob held still, afraid that even the smallest movement might shatter the moment. The stallion's massive head hovered close enough that Jacob could see the moonlight glint in his eyes. Wild still, but no longer unreadable. For the first time, the darkness inside Jacob felt a little less heavy. The next morning dawned brittle and bright, sunlight bouncing sharp off the snow. Jacob rose early, muscles stiff from another night on the barn's wooden bench. He carried water from the well, steam rising as it hit the icy air, and poured it into Thunder's trough. The stallion drank, head dipping low, his flanks trembling with each swallow. It was the first time Jacob had seen him do something so ordinary, so unremarkable, and yet it felt like a triumph. As the week stretched on, the bond continued to grow, though slowly, like thawed streams creeping across frozen fields. Thunder no longer fought against every approach. He still tested Jacob, snapping teeth or tossing his head, but the blind rage that once consumed him had dulled to wary resistance. Jacob began to wonder if the time had come to try something more. The thought came one crisp afternoon when the sky turned the color of steel and the wind sang through the empty stalks of corn. Grace had stopped by with another basket, this time filled with dried apples and a note, written in her careful hand. "Don't lose heart. Even the fiercest storms pass." Jacob had tucked the note into his pocket, close to his chest, where it stayed like a talisman. That evening, he entered the barn with the banjo. Thunder lifted his head, ears flicking, but didn't move. Jacob strummed a steady tune, one he remembered from childhood. A rhythm meant for work, not beauty. As the notes filled the air, Jacob unlatched the stall gate. The metal groaned, the sound slicing the music, and Thunder's muscles bunched in instant alarm. "Easy," Jacob murmured, stepping back. "It's just a gate, nothing more." Thunder pawed the ground, tail lashing. Jacob kept playing, voice low beneath the melody. Slowly, with hesitation thick as the cold, he opened the gate wider. The stallion's nostrils flared, but he did not bolt. Instead, he took one careful step forward, hooves crunching straw. Jacob's heart pounded. This was the first trial, the test of whether weeks of patience had been enough to earn even a sliver of trust. He kept strumming, every note steady, like a promise. Thunder stepped fully into the open space, his dark coat shimmering in the lantern light. He stood there, untethered for the first time since Jacob brought him home. Every instinct in the horse screamed for flight. Jacob could see it in the tremble of his muscles, but still, Thunder stayed. Jacob stopped playing and lowered the banjo. Silence rushed in, thick and tense. Thunder tossed his head, snorted, then circled the barn, hooves striking sparks from the packed earth. Jacob did not move to stop him. He simply watched, steady and calm, the way one watches a storm roll across the horizon, knowing resistance is useless, waiting instead for its passing. After a few tense minutes, Thunder slowed. His great body heaved with exertion, breath rolling in heavy plumes. He turned back toward Jacob, stamping once as if to declare his dominance. Jacob, without flinching, lifted the banjo and strummed a single note. The sound hung in the air, trembling. Thunder froze, ears pricked forward. The stallion's chest rose and fell, steam rising from his nostrils. Then, with a movement so deliberate it felt ceremonial, he stepped closer. Jacob swallowed hard. He could smell the animal now. Sweat, hay, the sharpness of fear layered with the rawness of survival. He extended his hand, palm open. This time, Thunder lowered his muzzle until it brushed Jacob's skin. The contact was fleeting, but real. It felt like fire, like victory, like the fragile start of something unbreakable. Jacob exhaled, the tension leaving his body in waves. "That's it," he whispered, voice breaking with relief. "That's all I needed." The stallion pulled back, shook his mane, and snorted as if embarrassed by his own surrender. Jacob chuckled under his breath, the sound strange and unfamiliar in his own ears. He had not laughed, not truly laughed, in years. But this was not the end of the trial. It was only the beginning. The next day, word spread through town that Jacob had loosed the devil horse from his stall. Bert arrived at the edge of the farm with 2 men, their coats flapping in the wind. Jacob saw them from the barn door, their faces smug, waiting for disaster. "Thought we'd come watch the show," Bert called, voice dripping with mockery. "Figured it wouldn't be long before that beast killed you." Jacob felt the sting of their words, the echo of laughter from before. But when he turned back, Thunder was standing steady in the open barn, head high, eyes fixed on him, not on Bert, not on the men, but on him. For the first time, Jacob felt no fear. He strummed the banjo, soft and steady. Thunder's ears twitched, then he stepped forward, calm as the falling snow. And in that moment, Jacob understood. This was the true trial. Not the stallion, not the gait, but the courage to keep going, even when the world watched only to see him fail. The sound of Bert's laughter carried across the frozen yard like a whip crack. Jacob stood in the barn doorway, the banjo cradled against his chest, thunder looming just behind him. The stallion shifted, ears flicking, muscles rippling beneath his black coat. He was ready to bolt, ready to fight. But for once, his eyes didn't burn with blind fury. They were fixed on Jacob. "Go on then," Bert sneered, spitting into the snow. "Play your little tune. Let's see how long before that beast throws you into the dirt." His companions chuckled, their breath white plumes in the air. Jacob strummed softly, fingers steady though his stomach twisted. A slow melody drifted into the brittle air, each note fragile as glass. Thunder stilled, head tilting, ears pricked forward. The laughter faltered for a moment, but Bert barked it louder, harsher, until it echoed like gunfire in Jacob's ears. That was all it took. Thunder reared with a scream, hooves slashing at the air, eyes rolling white. The ground shook beneath his weight as he crashed down, kicking at the dirt. Jacob stumbled backward, clutching the banjo to his chest. The two men shouted, scrambling for cover, while Bert roared with laughter, his voice booming. Jacob reached out, voice breaking. "Thunder, no!" But the stallion was lost, his fear ignited by the sound of scorn. He lunged, ropes snapping against the gate, breath coming in great bursts of steam. Jacob dropped the banjo, arms flung around the horse's neck, clinging with all his strength. "Don't do this," he cried, words muffled against the wild tremor of muscle beneath him. "Don't leave me too." The horse jerked, nearly throwing him aside. Jacob tightened his grip, eyes burning with tears. "I lost him in the war," he sobbed, voice raw and desperate. "I lost my brother in the smoke, in the fire. I can't lose you too, not to their laughter, not like this." The world narrowed to two beating hearts, one human, one beast, thundering together in terror and grief. For a breathless moment, Jacob thought thunder would crush him, trample him, finish what the war had started. But then, the stallion froze. His massive chest heaved, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Jacob's tears soaked his coat as he pressed his face into the warm, damp hide. The barn fell silent, except for Jacob's ragged sobs. The men outside had stopped laughing. Even Bert's cruel grin faltered. There was no spectacle here, no show to enjoy. Only a broken man clinging to a broken creature, both held together by desperation. Thunder shifted, releasing a sound that was neither a snort nor a whinny, but something deeper, a rumbling sigh that shook through his entire frame. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his great head lowered until it rested against Jacob's shoulder. Jacob's arms tightened, his voice trembling through the tears. "I don't need you to bow. I just need you to stay." For a long moment, they stood locked in that fragile embrace, soldier and stallion, grief meeting grief. When Jacob finally lifted his head, his face streaked with tears, he saw Bert standing stiff at the edge of the yard. The old man spat again, though his voice lacked its usual venom. "You'll never tame him," he muttered, turning away. But the laughter was gone, scattered like smoke in the cold wind. The other men followed, silent now, their boots crunching against the snow. The echo of their mockery lingered, but it no longer rang as sharp. Something had shifted in that barn, something even ridicule couldn't touch. Jacob sank onto the straw, arms wrapped around his knees. Thunder stood over him, breath rolling in heavy clouds, eyes calmer than Jacob had ever seen. The banjo lay in the dirt nearby. A string snapped, its voice silenced for now. But Jacob didn't need music tonight. He had the weight of the stallion's presence, steady and immovable, grounding him. And though tears still blurred his vision, he felt a strange certainty settle deep inside. This bond wasn't forged in triumph or applause. It was born in tears, in the cracks of broken men and broken beasts, where only truth could live. The snapped string lay curled like a question across the straw, silent and useless. Jacob picked up the banjo with shaking hands, cradling it the way one might hold a wounded bird. The wood bore a fresh scar where it had struck the ground, the resonance hollow now, incomplete. He brushed his thumb across the remaining strings, but the sound came fractured, jagged, a ghost of the melody it once carried. Thunder stood close, his flank warm in the cold barn, his breath steady. The stallion had calmed after the storm of fear and rage, but Jacob had not. He sat down heavily on the straw, banjo across his knees, and stared at the instrument as if it had betrayed him. The laughter from earlier still rang in his head, relentless, replaying over and over. His own breakdown, his tears, had been witnessed not only by the horse, but by the very men who wanted him to fail. He pressed his palms to his face. For years, he had hidden his grief behind silence, behind chores, behind the banjo's fragile voice. Now the silence felt like a weight he could not bear. The barn creaked as the wind shifted. Snow slid from the roof with a dull thump. Jacob lowered his hands and looked at Thunder. The stallion watched him, with a gaze that was no longer furious, but unreadable, deep, and ancient as the night itself. Jacob laughed bitterly, the sound dry and cracked. "Look at me," he whispered. "A soldier who came home, and I can't even hold myself together. I thought music would fix it. I thought maybe you would. But everything I touch breaks." Thunder shifted, his hoof striking the straw with a soft crunch. Jacob ran a hand over the broken string, his voice low. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I am just chasing ghosts." The barn door creaked open then, and a figure stepped inside, brushing snow from her shoulders. Grace. Her lantern spilled golden light into the shadows, softening the edges of the night. She looked from Jacob to the broken banjo, then to the stallion, whose massive head lowered slightly at her presence. Without speaking, she crossed the straw and knelt beside him. For a while, she said nothing, only sat close, the warmth of her presence filling the cold air. At last, she reached out and touched the snapped string, her fingers gentle. "Strings break," she said softly. "That doesn't mean the music is gone." Jacob swallowed hard. "It feels gone." She looked at him then, her eyes steady. "You've carried so much alone. Maybe it's time to let someone else carry part of it." Her words struck deeper than she knew. He thought of his brother, the promise they had made to return together. That promise had been buried overseas, leaving Jacob to carry the weight alone. Now Grace sat here, offering not to erase his burden, but to share it. Thunder let out a low sound, not a whinny, not a snort, but something close to a sigh. Jacob turned his head. The stallion's breath rose in clouds, his dark eyes fixed on the two of them. For the first time, Jacob felt as though the horse was not simply watching, but listening. He set the banjo aside and pressed his hands together, head bowed. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, voice breaking. "Not the war, not the farm, not even this horse." Grace placed her hand over his, firm and warm. "You don't have to know tonight. You just have to stay." The words loosened something inside him. Tears pricked his eyes again, but this time he did not hide them. He let them fall, quiet and steady, the way snow fell outside, soft, unrelenting, reshaping the world without sound. They sat together until the lantern burned low, the barn wrapped in silence that was no longer heavy, but alive, filled with presence. When Grace finally stood to leave, she touched the banjo once more. "Fix it when you're ready. The music will wait." After she was gone, Jacob remained. Thunder stepped forward, his muzzle brushing against Jacob's shoulder, not skittish, not violent, just there. Jacob lifted a trembling hand and let it rest against the stallion's neck. The warmth beneath his palm was real, grounding. The broken string still lay in the straw, but Jacob no longer saw it as an ending. It was only part of the journey, fragile proof that even broken things could hold meaning. The barn was quiet after Grace left, her lantern glow fading into the night. Jacob sat with his back against the stall, banjo resting useless across his knees. One broken string curled against the wood, silent proof of what had shattered inside him. Thunder stood nearby, ears twitching, breath steady, his dark eyes following every movement. Jacob touched the snapped string, then let his hand fall away. He couldn't fix it. Not yet. The thought of trying felt like pressing against a wound too raw to close. Instead, he set the banjo aside and leaned his head back against the wood, staring at the rafters where the moonlight spilled in pale lines. The silence was thick. Once, it would have crushed him, but tonight, something in it felt different. Maybe it was Grace's words lingering in his mind. "The music will wait." Maybe it was the horse standing so close he could hear each breath, steady and alive. Whatever it was, Jacob didn't feel swallowed by the silence. He felt challenged by it. Almost without thinking, he began to hum. Low at first, tentative, his voice rusty from disuse. The sound wavered in the cold air, but it was there. His own voice, unaccompanied, fragile, yet unbroken. Thunder's ears flicked. The stallion lifted his head, nostrils flaring, as if searching for the source of the strange new sound. Jacob closed his eyes and let the melody grow. It wasn't a song he had practiced. It wasn't even a song with words. It was something older, something his body seemed to remember when his mind could not. His father's voice hummed like this once, rocking him to sleep. His mother sang in the fields, half words carried by the wind. Now it was his turn to let sound rise from the silence. Thunder shifted closer, his great body brushing the wooden rail. The low hum seemed to weave into the rhythm of his breath, two tones blending, human and hoarse, wounded and wild. Jacob opened his eyes, surprised to find Thunder standing almost nose to nose with him, ears forward, eyes wide. You hear it, don't you? Jacob whispered between verses. No strings, just us. The stallion snorted, a warm gust that lifted Jacob's hair. He laughed softly, shaking his head. Guess we don't need much after all. For the next hour, Jacob hummed and sang, the sounds imperfect, but whole. Sometimes he tapped the broken banjo for rhythm. Sometimes he let silence hold the space between them. Thunder stayed near the entire time, steady as the earth itself. The bond felt different tonight. Less about the instrument, more about the man willing to stand unarmed, stripped of every shield. When Jacob's voice finally faded, his throat raw, he pressed a hand against Thunder's muzzle. The horse did not flinch. Instead, he leaned into the touch, heavy and certain, as if to say the music without strings had been enough. The following days, Jacob carried this discovery with him. Each morning, he hummed as he shoveled snow, as he chopped wood, as he carried water from the well. The notes floated into the frozen air, sometimes carried away by the wind, sometimes sinking into the silence of the farm. Thunder followed the sound, ears pricking whenever Jacob's voice broke the stillness. At night, in the barn, he sang again. Not songs of beauty, but songs of survival, songs stitched from memory and sorrow. Thunder listened, always listening, his eyes softer now, his body less restless. Jacob began to realize that maybe it wasn't the banjo that connected them, but the willingness to speak when silence had reigned too long. One evening, as snow glittered like diamonds under the lantern light, Jacob leaned against the stall and whispered, "You're teaching me something, aren't you? That I don't need to be whole to be heard." Thunder exhaled deeply, warm breath rolling across Jacob's chest. Jacob smiled, tired but sincere. In the stillness of that barn, with broken strings and an imperfect voice, they had found something stronger than music. They had found a language neither laughter nor ridicule could touch. A song without strings, born only of breath, presence, and trust. Snow had stopped falling, but the town glittered white beneath garlands of lanterns and strings of evergreen. The Christmas fair arrived as it always did, bright against the bleakness of winter, promising warmth, laughter, and a reprieve from the hard months that lay ahead. Jacob hadn't planned on attending. Crowds meant questions, and questions meant ridicule. But Grace had come to his door, cheeks red from the cold, insisting gently that he couldn't spend every holiday alone in the barn. So he came. The square pulsed with life, children's boots stamping patterns into the snow, women serving cider steaming from copper pots, the blacksmith's hammer clanging even on a day meant for celebration. A choir sang carols outside the church, their voices carrying clear and strong across the square. Jacob felt a strange ache in his chest, remembering how once his mother had sung with them, her voice rising above the rest. Grace slipped her arm through his, guiding him toward the center of the crowd. People turned, whispering. Their eyes slid past Grace and landed on him, on the man who had dragged the devil horse from the fairground weeks before. The murmur spread like fire through dry fields. And then Bert's voice cut through it all. "There he is!" The old rancher stepped onto the wooden stage where the mayor and elders had gathered. His coat was trimmed with fur, his hat pulled low, his grin wide and mocking. "Our dreamer boy. Tell me, Jacob, did your beast finally learn to dance to your broken fiddle?" Laughter erupted. Jacob froze, but Grace's hand tightened on his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't let him steal this night from you." But Bert wasn't finished. He raised his voice, addressing the crowd. "We've all heard tales of this miracle horse. How about we see it with our own eyes? Unless, of course, you're afraid to show us the truth." The murmur swelled into a roar. People stamped their feet, calling Jacob's name. Some were jeering, others curious, but all demanded a spectacle. Jacob's stomach clenched. He hadn't come here to prove anything. He had no banjo to hide behind, no strings to steady his hands. Only his voice, his presence, and the fragile trust he had built with Thunder. Grace leaned close. "You don't have to," she whispered. But Jacob looked at the crowd, at Bert's smirk, at the children craning their necks to see. Then he thought of the nights in the barn, of broken strings, of humming into the silence while Thunder listened. This wasn't about proving Bert wrong. It was about proving to himself that he hadn't held on in vain. He nodded once. The crowd parted as Jacob crossed the square. Snow crunched beneath his boots, each step heavy with memory. He disappeared down the street, then returned minutes later, leading Thunder. Gasps rose. The stallion's black coat shimmered under lantern light, breath billowing like smoke from a furnace. He moved with restless power, but his eyes stayed locked on Jacob. Bert barked a laugh. "Perfect. Now let's see your circus trick." Jacob ignored him. He led Thunder to the center of the square, unlatched the rope, and let it fall. The crowd sucked in a breath. The stallion stood free in the open, untethered, wild against the backdrop of glowing pine and carols. Jacob stepped in front of him, heart pounding. He had no instrument, only the voice that had carried him through sleepless nights. Closing his eyes, he began to hum. The sound was low, almost lost at first, but it carried. Steady, unshaken. Thunder's ears pricked forward, his massive head lowered an inch. Jacob kept humming, letting the melody grow, rise, and fall like waves against the shore. The crowd quieted. Even the laughter died, curiosity pressing in on every side. Snowflakes drifted through the lantern light, settling on Jacob's hair, his coat. Thunder exhaled, stepped forward once, then again. The earth seemed to hold its breath. Jacob opened his eyes, his voice unwavering. Then it happened. The stallion bent his front knees, lowering himself onto the snowy ground. His black coat gleamed as he bowed his head before Jacob, breath steaming in clouds that rose like incense into the winter night. A cry broke from the crowd. Then silence. Thick, awestruck. The same mouths that had mocked him now hung open, struck dumb by the sight of the untamable beast bowing before the man they called a fool. Jacob's throat tightened. He stopped humming, his voice breaking into silence. But Thunder stayed bowed, steady, as if waiting for the approval of the only man who had ever listened. Jacob laid his hand gently on the stallion's neck, whispering so softly only the horse could hear. "Thank you." When he lifted his head, he saw faces wet with tears. Even children, their mittens pressed to their mouths, eyes shining with wonder. Bert turned away, jaw clenched, the mocking gone from his face. Grace stood at the edge of the square, her hands clasped to her chest, smiling through tears. The bells of the church struck then, ringing across the night, and it felt less like celebration and more like blessing. For a breath that seemed to last an entire winter, nothing moved. Thunder's knees pressed into the snow, steam pouring from his nostrils, his great head lowered as if to listen to the hush itself. Jacob stood before him, glove laid flat against the warm slope of the stallion's neck. All the harsh edges of the square, voices, judgments, the bright clatter of celebration, fell away until there were only 2 heartbeats making a small weather of their own. Somewhere behind them, a lantern hissed in the cold. Children forgot to shiver. A carol that had been drifting from the church door faltered and faded, the final note hanging in the air like a star that refused to fall. Jacob could feel the weight of the town's gaze settle on his shoulders, but it pressed like a quilt, rather than a burden. He had spent so long bracing for impact that he almost didn't know what to do with gentleness. He kept his voice low, meant for the horse alone. "You did good," he murmured, each word a stroke. "You're safe." Thunder's ear flicked toward the sound. A tremor passed through the stallion's neck, not fear. Release. Jacob lifted his hand, and with the patience you'd use to wake a sleeping child, traced the ridge of the mane down to the pole. The coarse hair held a dusting of snow, the same white that flecked Jacob's lashes. Bert tried to laugh then. The sound came out thin, a habit with no air behind it. He cleared his throat and forced a shrug, but the gesture looked borrowed. The 2 men beside him found sudden interest in their boots. Across the square, Mrs. Carter pressed her mitten to her mouth. The blacksmith lifted his cap. Grace stood near the cider stall with tears glossing her eyes. A smile, breaking like morning. "Let him up when you're ready," someone whispered, like speaking too loud might shatter the spell. Jacob didn't answer. He closed his eyes and began to hum again. Not to command, not to perform, but to give the moment the room it deserved. The melody was small, threadbare, the kind of tune you stitch into a long winter so it doesn't unravel you. Thunder breathed in time with the sound. When Jacob finally stopped, the horse stayed down a heartbeat longer, as though learning the shape of stillness, then rose with the careful strength of a bridge lifting from fog. The crowd exhaled in one body. Sound returned delicately. A child's gulped sob, the soft click of rosary beads, the creak of leather as someone shifted their weight. Life tried to remember its lines. An old man stepped forward from the ring of onlookers. His coat hung loose on a frame that had once been large, the set of his shoulders stubbornly square. He lifted a shaking hand toward Jacob and let it fall again, as if the gesture cost more than he could afford. "I fought in the First War," he said, voice rough as a barn door. "Came back with more noise in my head than a stampede. Couldn't make anything quiet it, not church, not sleep. My wife used to rest her palm on my chest till I found my breath again." He nodded at the horse. "Looks like you found your palm." Jacob swallowed. The words slid into a place the cold couldn't reach. "Thank you," he said. But what he meant was, "I hear you. I'm not alone." From the edge of the crowd, a boy with a knitted cap too large for him tugged free of his mother's hand. He inched closer, boots leaving small commas in the thin crust of snow. "Mister?" he asked Jacob, eyes as large and certain as bells. Can I touch him?" Jacob looked to Thunder, who stood square and listening. The white of his eye softened to a dark, steady glow. "2 fingers," Jacob said gently. "On the shoulder, and stand where he can see you." The boy obeyed with a reverence usually reserved for altars. His two small fingers found warm hide. Thunder flicked an ear, then lowered his head a fraction, the way a tall man bows to a child so the world can meet in the middle. The boy gasped and laughed in the same breath. The pure sound of something made right when it could have gone wrong. Behind him, his mother pressed a hand to her chest, a prayer without words. Grace reached Jacob then, not touching him at first, simply entering the small weather he and Thunder were making and letting her breath fall into its rhythm. Up close, her smile held 1,000 miles of winter roads and the promise of spring at the end of each. "You didn't win them over," she said softly. "You let them see." He let out a breath that felt older than he was. "I don't know what happens next." "You go home," she said, a glint of humor in the corner of her eyes. "And you feed your horse." The mayor, who had spent the entire event trying to be both present and invisible, finally remembered protocol. He cleared his throat, announced that the evening's raffle would resume, that the choir would sing again, that hot cider could be found for a nickel. The town obeyed with relief. People crave a return to normal after standing too close to awe. After all, someone still had to talk fence posts. Someone had to ask about mortgage rates for spring planting. Someone had to remind the general store to stock salt blocks. And, spoken like a charm against uncertainty, home insurance for barns that had seen a century of wind. The ordinary knit itself back together, grateful for its own steady stitch. Bert lingered like the last patch of dirty snow in a shady yard. He approached Jacob not as a victor, but as a man who had accidentally found himself alone. For a second, he looked younger, as if the years might flee if he held still. "You got your trick," he said, but the words lacked fangs. He stared at Thunder's legs, then at Jacob's hands. "Just don't forget, an animal's an animal. It'll break you if you look away." Jacob nodded, not in surrender, but in recognition. "Then I won't look away." They stood there like opposite banks of the same river. At last, Bert grimaced at the cold and turned, coat flapping. The space he left behind didn't fill with laughter this time. It simply accepted him going. Grace slipped her arm through Jacob's, and together they threaded back through the square. People parted not to inspect, but to offer small nods that felt like lanterns set at the edge of a long road. Someone pressed a paper cup of cider into Jacob's hand. He wrapped his fingers around the heat and let it be what it was. Thunder followed at a walk, head near Jacob's shoulder, the rope slack, the night bright enough to see without asking. At the hitching rail, Jacob paused and looked back at the square. The choir had found the carol again, this time steadier, deeper, the harmony thick as cream. The church bell marked the hour, patient as snowfall. He set the cider on the wagon seat and turned to the stallion. Snow dusted the black coat, a tiny crown formed where it gathered between Thunder's ears. "Thank you," Jacob said again, "because gratitude doesn't wear out with use." Thunder answered with a long, slow exhale that fogged the air between them, and then broke apart into nothing. Jacob rested his forehead lightly to Thunder's, the gentlest collision, until their breaths aligned. They started for home, under a sky so clear it seemed the stars had drawn their chairs closer to listen. The wagon creaked, the harness rang a small music, the road unspooled. The town behind them resumed its stories, its deals and decisions, its saving and spending and winter worries. But the square now held a new kind of footprint that no drift would fully erase. the impression of knees, and the memory of a crowd that learned how silence sounds when it tells the truth. When they reached the farm, the fields lay quiet as a sleeping lake. Jacob unbuckled the traces with hands that didn't shake. In the barn's lantern light, Thunder turned once in the stall and settled without pacing. Jacob didn't reach for the banjo. He didn't need to. He only stood for a while, listening to the slow turning gears of the night and the soft, dependable machinery of another living thing at rest. "You and me," he said finally, not as a vow this time, but as a fact. The kind you can hang a coat on. He slid the bolt across the barn door, the metal sure as a period at the end of a sentence, and stepped into the starlit dark that knew their names. The road home stretched white and endless, lantern light bobbing at the wagon's edge, the stars gleaming overhead as if they, too, had witnessed what happened in the square. Jacob drove in silence, one hand steady on the reins, the other curled loosely in his lap. Thunder walked beside the wagon, untethered now, shadow and flesh moving as one. Each plume of his breath rose into the night and dissolved, as though even the air knew when to keep quiet. When the farmhouse finally emerged from the dark, Jacob felt no weight on his shoulders. No shame, no doubt, not even the old ache of ridicule. What lingered was something quieter, something so gentle it frightened him. Peace. He unhitched Thunder, spread fresh straw in the stall, and leaned for a moment against the wooden post, watching as the stallion lowered his great head to drink. The barn was still, except for the rhythm of water and the low, steady rumble of an animal content. Jacob carried the lantern back to the house, set it on the table, and sat with his banjo. The broken string remained coiled across the wood, waiting. He traced it with a fingertip, then closed the case without playing. Tonight didn't need sound. Tonight, silence itself was enough. The next morning broke bright and clear, sunlight refracting through icicles along the eaves. Jacob rose early and worked the farm with a steadiness he hadn't felt since before the war. His body moved through the chores as if it finally trusted the day to hold him, hauling water, chopping wood, mending fence rails. Thunder followed his progress with calm eyes, ears flicking at the sound of every hammer strike and axe fall. Neighbors came by in the days that followed. Some brought gifts, jars of preserves, sacks of feed, even a pair of wool mittens stitched by Mrs. Carter herself. They didn't say much, but their presence was a quiet offering, a recognition of something they had seen, but couldn't quite name. Jacob accepted each gift with gratitude and an awkward nod, then returned to his work. He didn't crave their praise. The memory of silence in the square, the collective breath held as Thunder bowed, was enough to carry him. Grace visited often, her presence less like interruption and more like a thread woven into the fabric of his days. She would sit at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, listening as Jacob spoke haltingly about the war, about the noise he still carried inside his skull. She never interrupted. She never told him to be stronger. She only listened, her silence a balm, her eyes steady. One evening, as twilight turned the snowfields lavender, Jacob stood at the barn door humming. He had no banjo, no strings, just the hum that had become his prayer. Thunder approached, breath fogging the chill, and pressed his muzzle into Jacob's shoulder. The weight was firm, grounding, as if saying, "I'm here. You're not alone." Jacob closed his eyes and let the silence between them swell until it filled the barn like light. That night he dreamed not of war, but of fields in summer, corn tall, sky endless, his father strumming a banjo by the porch. He woke with tears on his face, but they were not the tears of loss. They were the tears of a man remembering he was still alive. The healing came not with fanfare, not with spectacle, but with ordinary days stitched together. One hum, one step, one breath at a time. Jacob learned to measure progress not by victories, but by moments. The boy's fingers brushing Thunder's coat, the neighbor's quiet nod, the warmth of Grace's hand resting over his own. And as winter deepened, he found that silence no longer haunted him. It healed him. The same quiet that once reminded him of death now spoke of life, of trust between man and horse, of love that asked for nothing but presence, of a town that had finally learned to listen. Jacob stood often by the barn at dusk, watching Thunder's breath rise in steady clouds. Each exhale was like a hymn without words, a sermon without sound. And Jacob, for the first time in years, no longer felt the urge to run from it. He stayed. He listened. And in that listening, he was remade. Winter nights stretched long, but they no longer weighed heavy. Jacob had begun to welcome the quiet, to sit at the kitchen table with only the ticking of the clock and the slow burn of the stove for company. Thunder's steady presence filled the farm, his breath rising against the barn's rafters, his hooves echoing in calm rhythms that felt more like heartbeat than noise. Yet the banjo sat silent in its case. The broken string remained, coiled like a scar. Jacob would touch it sometimes, running a finger along the wood, but he never opened the case fully. He told himself he didn't need it anymore. The hum of his voice, the steady exhale of the horse, the comfort of silence had become enough. Still, each night the case waited, patient as earth under snow. One evening, Grace arrived with a bundle tucked under her arm. She shook the snow from her coat and laid the bundle on the table, unwrapping it to reveal a packet of new strings. "Thought you might need these," she said simply, her smile quiet but certain. Jacob stared at the thin coils of metal. His throat tightened. "I haven't played since." He let the words trail, but she understood. "You don't have to play for them," Grace said gently. "You can play for you or for him." Her glance drifted toward the barn window where Thunder's silhouette shifted against the glow of lantern light. That night, Jacob opened the case. The banjo smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, memories embedded in its grain. He set the broken instrument across his knees and worked slowly, threading the new string into place. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of memory. Each twist of the peg pulled him back to summer evenings on the porch, to his father's calloused hands guiding his own. When the string was set, he plucked it once. The note was bright, startling in its clarity. It rang through the farmhouse like sunlight piercing a shutter. Jacob sat motionless, heart hammering, then struck another note, then a chord. The sound filled the empty rooms, brushing away cobwebs of silence. He closed his eyes and played. Not the war songs, not the sad laments of a broken man, but the simple tunes his father once played when the fields were green and life was whole. The door creaked. Grace leaned against the frame, watching, her smile soft and unguarded. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Later, Jacob carried the banjo to the barn. Thunder lifted his head at the sound of the door, ears twitching, eyes gleaming in lantern light. Jacob sat on the straw and began to play, fingers steady now, voice weaving low beneath the chords. The stallion shifted closer, his breath puffing in warm bursts. He lowered his head until his muzzle brushed the strings, curious, listening. Jacob laughed softly, the sound unforced. "Easy there," he murmured. "It's not much, but it's ours." The music rose and fell, imperfect, but alive. Thunder stood still, eyes half-lidded, his body swaying almost imperceptibly. The barn itself seemed to lean into the sound, beams creaking as though remembering other nights filled with music. Jacob felt his chest loosen, the ache of grief no longer a weight but a rhythm. Something carried, something shared. For the first time since the war, he didn't feel like a soldier pretending to be a farmer. He felt like a man who had come home. The nights that followed found him playing more often. Sometimes he played alone in the farmhouse, the notes drifting out into the cold air. Sometimes he played in the barn, Thunder listening with a patience no human could match. Grace would visit, sitting nearby with her hands folded in her lap, letting the music do what words could not. The broken string lay forgotten in a drawer. Not discarded, but kept. A reminder that even what snaps can be mended, that sound returns after silence, that hearts can be tuned again. Jacob no longer played to chase away the noise of the past. He played because music was part of his breath, part of his father's legacy, part of the bond between man and horse that had carried them both through winter's hardest trials. And each time his fingers found the strings, he felt the truth settle deeper. He was not the man the town had mocked, not just the soldier who came back with ghosts. He was Jacob Harris, farmer, son, friend, and the keeper of a music that healed. Thunder snorted softly in agreement, as if to say the song belonged to both of them. Winter held the farm in its grip. But Jacob no longer felt imprisoned by it. The snow that once pressed against the windows like a wall now looked like a blanket, heavy but protective. Days found him moving with quiet rhythm, feeding thunder, hauling wood, tending to chores with a steadiness that surprised even himself. Nights belonged to music again, not loud, not triumphant, but alive in the simple patterns of his father's old songs. On the final night of the year, Jacob stepped outside as the moon rose, the fields glowing white beneath its cold light. Thunder stood near the fence line, black against silver, his breath rolling in steady clouds. Jacob carried the banjo across his back, though tonight he did not plan to play. Tonight was for something else. He walked into the barn, lantern swinging at his side, and leaned the instrument carefully against a beam. Then he crossed to the stallion, laying a hand on the strong neck. The horse shifted, turning his head to breathe warm air across Jacob's chest. Jacob closed his eyes. "I thought I'd lost everything," he whispered. "My friend, my peace, my place in this world. But you," his voice faltered, then steadied. "You taught me I wasn't done living, that broken things can still hold." Thunder shifted his weight and lowered his head, pressing gently against Jacob's shoulder. The weight was firm, grounding. Jacob laughed softly, tears stinging his eyes, not from grief, but from the release of it. He led the stallion out into the open yard. The snow crunched beneath their steps, the air sharp with cold. Above them, stars crowded the sky, brighter than Jacob had seen in years. He stopped in the center of the field, breath fogging, and turned to Thunder. The horse stood tall, mane tossing in the wind, his presence as certain as the earth itself. For a long moment, they simply breathed together. The sound filled the night, not music, not words, just the rhythm of lungs rising and falling, steady as a tide. Jacob felt it anchor him in ways no song ever had. "You and me," he said quietly, repeating words once spoken as a fragile promise. Now they were a truth carved deep as stone. Thunder exhaled hard, a cloud of white surging between them, and Jacob smiled. He lifted his forehead until it rested lightly against the stallion's. Cold and warmth mingled, man and horse bound not by rope or command, but by trust born in silence, in patience, in the stubborn will to keep trying. Behind them, the farmhouse windows glowed golden, the outline of Grace moving inside as she set the table for the year's final supper. Jacob knew he would join her soon, but for now, he lingered in the winter night, letting it settle around him, unafraid of the quiet. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest chime of bells from the town miles away. Thunder's ears flicked toward the sound, then back to Jacob. The stallion lowered his head once more, as if to bow, not in surrender this time, but in kinship. Jacob placed a hand on his neck. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying, for teaching me how to stay." The stars burned brighter. Snow fell in delicate flakes, drifting between them, melting on warm skin and warm hide. The night breathed with them, not empty, not cruel, but whole. And as the year turned beneath that winter sky, Jacob Harris stood not as the soldier who returned broken, not as the fool mocked in the square, but as a man who had learned to live again, through the quiet strength of a black horse who once bowed only to him. The breath they shared rose white into the starlight, then vanished, leaving only the bond itself, invisible but unbreakable. And maybe that's the real miracle, not the bowing of a wild horse, but the way broken souls can find each other and heal. If this story touched you, leave me a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. I'd love to know you stayed until the end. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories of hope, healing, and the unbreakable bond between people and animals are waiting for you.